will inevitably fail because we are trying things whose outcomes we cannot completely predict. For example, we might face a failed business, bad decision, a broken relationship, or poor performance, but none of these automatically make us foolish or unsuccessful, because what matters is what the failure leaves behind. A useful failure always gives us something. It could be knowledge, skill, judgment, self-knowledge, or even direction. So the shame isn't really in saying I failed, but I failed and refused to learn anything from it. Another subtle danger is that we can turn failure into an identity rather than an experiment. And instead of asking, what did this teach me? We conclude that it proves that we are incapable. And in that case, the failure produces pain, but no wisdom. So the ideal isn't therefore to avoid failure, but to become someone who extracts value from experience. A failure can eventually become part of a success because we can metabolize it into something useful. Realize that we cannot always control whether an experience goes badly, but we have more control over whether it becomes instructive. The unproductive way to fail is when we repeatedly do things that don't move us forward, or avoid meaningful attempts altogether, and therefore gain little that can actually improve our next attempt. And productive failure is not necessarily pleasant. Sometimes the feedback hurts and we discover that we're not as skilled as we thought, because a project that doesn't make money or an idea that seemed brilliant turns out to be mediocre. It can hurt, but we're gaining contact with reality, and reality is what allows competence to develop. You cannot become excellent at something merely by thinking about how excellent you could become. You need repeated encounters with the gap between what you intended to do and what actually happened. So the real failure can't be the absence of experimentation. If suppose someone desperately wants to build something meaningful but spends every evening scrolling, consuming entertainment, procrastinating, or numbing themselves in whatever way, they haven't technically failed at the project, but they haven't even run the experiment, and therefore they receive almost no useful information. But what they don't discover is that they don't know the information of what they're actually good at, what people value, what enjoyment or dislikes or what improvement or opportunities actually exist, what their limitations are. They won't get that information. They remain trapped in hypothetical life. This can be more damaging than ordinary failure, because ordinary failure at least gives reality a chance to teach. Addiction and numbing are particularly dangerous because they close the loop. Since when we repeatedly use something primarily to escape discomfort, we create a pattern. Discomfort leads to escape, which leads to temporary relief, and then less action, and then more dissatisfaction, hence more discomfort, and then even more escape. So no experiment, no feedback, no adaptation. We're not moving towards a goal and discovering what works. We're simply regulating how uncomfortable we feel in the present. And that can actually create the illusion that we are stuck because circumstances aren't changing, when in reality, the learning and action loop hasn't stopped. This doesn't mean that someone struggling with addiction or compulsive behavior is simply lazy or weak. These patterns can actually become very powerful. We have to be careful here. There is even a subtler version of I tried, I failed, I felt ashamed, and then concluded something about myself. And then I stopped trying, something negative. This is failure converted into identity rather than information. And instead, the happier response or the healthier response is asking why something didn't work. That tiny shift from what's wrong with me to what does this result tell me turns failure into experimentation. And a life of growth probably isn't one in which somehow we learn to stop failing, but one in which failure becomes increasingly informative. We make a mistake and become slightly wiser because of it. We try again and become slightly more competent. In the words of Alex Homozy, we pay our ignorance debt. Pay your ignorance debt. as soon as possible. Over enough iterations, we can look back and realize that what felt like a long string of failures was actually the process by which we became capable. What am I getting at here? What I'm getting at is that the tragedy is actually spending years avoiding the experiment or repeating the same experiment without paying attention to the results. Psychologically, we experience something first and only later construct what it meant. And so the significance of a moment is often visible after it is done. Steve Jobs in 2005 at Stanford gave a speech and said that you can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking backwards. He had dropped out of college and took a calligraphy course that seemed to have no practical purpose at the time. But 10 years later, what he had learned from that course influenced the typography of the Macintosh. Looking forward, there was no obvious connection, and yet looking backward, the connection seemed almost inevitable. But we nevertheless have to create the dots. We have to create the dots. So act, encounter reality, learn, act again, accumulate experiences, and eventually you will see the pattern. The future will only ever be experienced as uncertainty. It is what it is. We will spend our lives moving through disconnected looking dots, while simultaneously creating the material from which our future story will eventually be constructed. Another thing is, in Amazon's 2015 shareholder letter, Jeff Bezos wrote that failure and invention are inseparable twins. His reasoning was that invention requires experiment, and if you already know something will work, it isn't really an experiment. He argued that organizations have to tolerate a series of failed experiments in order to discover the few things that actually work. He observed that a few major successes can compensate for dozens of things that did not work out. Failure isn't necessarily the opposite of success in an experimental system. It is one of the costs of discovering the success. Bezos' Amazon philosophy essentially is that make enough intelligent bets that some of them will produce extraordinary outcomes. You don't need every experiment to succeed. We shouldn't feel embarrassed by our failures, but only by an inability to grow anything useful or instructive from them. If you're genuinely trying to invent something new, some failure isn't evidence that the process is broken. It might be evidence that you're actually exploring. So, hope you got value out of this video. Until next time.